Hello, welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study, both the live session on Sunday morning and those connected virtually. The theme in the first two chapters of Hebrews has been centered around the Son's superiority to the angels. That will continue somewhat throughout Hebrews, and will still be there today. But in today's, we'll see a major new twist to that that will develop during the discussion, and which will turn out to be the heart of Hebrews Christianity. So let's read chapter 2, verses 10 through 8, which is our lesson number 7 in this, if you're tracking. Starting with verse 10 in the New Revised Standard Version. It was fitting that God, for whom and through whom all things exist, in bringing many children to let me back up there, I lost something. In bringing many children to glory, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through suffering. For the one who sacrifices and those who are sacrificed all have one Father. For this reason, Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters, saying, I will proclaim your name to my brothers and sisters. In the midst of the congregation, I will praise you. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, here am I and the children whom God has given me. Since therefore the children share flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared the same thing, so that through death he might destroy the one who has power of death, that is, the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by the fear of death. For it is clear that he did not come to help angels, but the descendants of Abraham. Therefore, he had to become like his brothers and sisters in every respect, so that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God, to make a sacrifice of atonement for the sins of the people. Because he himself was tested by what he suffered, he is able to help those who are being tested. Instead of continuing by direct comparisons of the Son with angels, the writer here in Hebrews now turns to more of a practice of quoting biblical text to defend his position, and seems now suddenly to focus on the Son as a Savior and becoming a merciful and faithful high priest. Christ as high priest is not developed much elsewhere in the New Testament, yet there are short references to it at times. The idea of God's definitive word to the world is here in this epistle as well, as is the suffering servant as a Savior, which are the two ideas that come from John and Mark's Gospels, respectively. But here in Hebrews, it's the full humanization of Christ as a necessary condition for qualifying death as a Savior that is the focus and the center of the Christology that we find in the Epistle of Hebrews. In verse 10, the writer opens with incarnation was for a little while, and makes the point that this was done at the initiative of God. He is clearly making a point that the Son incarnated as Jesus was not some sort of accidental coincidence in the history taught Dr. Fred Craddock. It is the most interesting, he says, that the Hebrews author seems to be defending God here. Some scholars add with this idea that it was fitting for God, almost as if questioning God. Nowhere else in the New Testament does such an idea of defending God develop. God's purpose for doing this is here too. That is, to bring many sons to the glory. That word sons there, by the way, will be translated in some translations children, or in others maybe sons and daughters, as it is, I think, in the New International Version. Dr. Donald Hagner at Fuller Institute and others teaches this is referring to the issue that the full humanness of Christ was necessary to make possible this saving death. He and Craddock also has a similar comment. Both point out not to lose that frame of reference throughout the rest of Hebrews as well as in today's class. That the Son, because the Son is the objective of all of God's activities in the rest of Hebrews. The total appropriateness of God to do this for humans is a Christian concept that is here in Hebrews and essentially taught nowhere else in the New Testament. In fact, several Greek scholars teach this is not based on Jewish theology or belief, but much more likely a Greek concept that has crept into the religion. The closest we find to the appropriateness elsewhere is in Matthew and John, where he addresses the conduct of John the Baptist. The Greek word in verse 10, translated as pioneer, in the New Revised Standard Version, which I believe is author in the NIV, but other places it might be path or route. That it's critical here, that word. It is the Son's pioneering work while on earth that made the Son perfect in the eyes of God. That is, it's his work here, what he did and the path he laid, that qualifies him as the high priest, scholars say. This completeness refers not to moral flawlessness, however. They teach that it's part of the preparation for priesthood that we find in the Old Testament, especially in the first 5 books. His obedience to God's will and the suffering that he endured, referring to Christ, as a result of that obedience to God's will, is the point here that the Hebrews writer is making. The Israelite concept that the high priest was to be chosen from normal human beings that experienced normal human life, and not some sort of sheltered life of the rich and famous, he says, is buried in this argument. However, that concept of choosing a high priest from such people was lost by David's time and became more of an inherited type position. Any life that Jesus would have had short of suffering and death would not have been human enough, several scholars teach, is the concept that the Hebrews writer is trying to convey. As humans live, suffer, and die, that's human life. And it's that aspect of humanity that is necessary here. Being treated as a protected from humanity would not have worked in God's eyes, is essentially buried in this this concept many scholars point out. He had to come from a position where he lives a normal life as an underprivileged person, so to speak, suffers and dies the life of the average human. Several scholars add this is referring back to the conditions necessary for consecration of the priest found in Leviticus, Exodus, and Numbers. The high priest is to have had an experience, much of human experience before being appointed to that office. Not someone who was born and lived with a silver spoon in his mouth, says Dr. Fred Craddock. Both Fred Craddock and Donald Hagner point out also that it is understood in verse 11 that this the sanctifier and the sanctified have been united in the Son here, and that that his followers are united also with him. If they remain faithful, that's the condition of humanity, to remain faithful to this concept. Dr. Harold Attridge of Yale, who is a Greek scholar, by the way, and a religious scholar, but at the time he wrote his compendium, he was a professor at Notre Dame. He's now, I think, dean at Yale. But in his compendium on Hebrews, he says that establishing and maintaining solidarity with the Son and his people, meaning sons and daughters, that is, those faithful to him, is a key emphasis here, inferred from the text, and that was the objective of God, that the people remain faithful to his Son. He says such a concept is much more Hellenistic theology, however, than Jewish. The only problem is that this idea, he says, and he's speaking now as a Jewish scholar, as a Greek scholar, he says, of suffering of a God is not necessarily Greek or in the Hellenistic Greek culture, Hellenistic Jewish culture of the first century. But here in Hebrews, God has taken the initiative to impose suffering of Jesus as a human in order for him to be an appropriate sacrificial function, or have the appropriate sacrificial function. Clearly an original concept, Dr. Attridge says. This idea of salvation through such an individual, through such an example, and salvation as he defines it, he says, at the time, meaning that you're removed from God and now you get to reestablish. Salvation meant being reestablished with God. Is brought about through this suffering of this glorified one who has been humanized so that he suffers and is tested under true human circumstances. Only such an individual could have met the qualifications of being an appropriate sacrificial lamb. Dr. Attridge points out that this perfection terminology here in Hebrews most likely comes from the Greek theology, however, the perfection terminology, because the terminology that's normally used in Judaism is purification, not perfection. In the Hebrew Old Testament, as we always see purification. But in the translation of that Hebrew Old Testament into Greek, that version's called the Septuagint. In the Septuagint, this word perfection sometimes slips in preference to purification. Perfection was an idea in Philos, the famous philosopher, Greek philosopher's teachings, says many, especially when he referred to religious context of perfection / purification, if you will. Several Greek scholars teach that the Hebrew author here seems to be using perfection in the philo sense when describing or referring to the Levitical protocols that the Hebrews writer is using here. This consecration protocol for the high priest is would have been referred to by Philo, that might be another way of saying it, as a perfection, finding perfection. The association of death with perfection is from the book of Wisdom and Maccabees, though, in some would say, which were books that we looked at in the Apocrypha a couple years ago. There is use in that framework of especially this idea that came up a couple times, you might recall, of where a righteous man dies an untimely and suffering death. And the idea there is that that person meets the moral qualifications for perfection by this untimely and nasty death, if you will, even though he was a righteous person. That's a concept that was slipping in that last 400 years of Judaism, especially in the Hellenistic area, some scholars would say. Moreover, they say that the Jews at Qumran used this perfection terminology. It was referred to by them walking in perfection rather than purifications. Several scholars suggest that the Hebrews author is using perfection in this sort of more complex and difficult to explain meaning here that seems to be found nowhere in particular in the New Testament or the Old Testament as it's being used in Hebrews. Where it comes from, they really don't know, but they say this really, they're just scant bits of stuff around in the Apocrypha somewhat, and just really not very much in the Greco-Roman literature of the time. So it is a unique concept. We will see more of this model, however, as we continue to study Hebrews, because Christ's suffering made him the perfect model. That concept is going to be driven throughout this epistle. The Son, or Jesus as high priest, however, is a Jewish concept that comes from Leviticus 18, where it is prophesied, according to what's cited here, that God will raise up a high priest who will execute righteousness and judgment on earth and open the gates of paradise and will bound up the devil. I think the word that's used there for devil is Belair. In verse 14 and 15, the Hebrew authors is saying the ultimate reason for incarnation was to make possible the sacrificial death of a perfect human. That's sort of the summary that Dr. Hagner gives. And that death was for the heirs of Abraham, not just the Israelites, but also those who maintain the faith and are adopted into the Abrahamic line, tying in with Paul's teachings there. That connection of Abraham through faith is a, of course, big part of Paul's gospel that's very clearly laid out in the book of Romans. So it is the humanness of Jesus, that is the Son, that enables him to serve as high priest, is this new concept that's now surfaced here in the Hebrews. The title and position of Hebrews author, that word high priest, is what he will use now quite often throughout the rest of this epistle. He will make the point repeatedly that only such an individual could atone for the sins of people. A perfect human lamb, that's perfection, is connected to his obedience to God's will while being fully tested as a human, not as God. That is his fitness for being an atonement sacrifice, is Hebrews scholarship, many scholars say. The idea he must be completely human for God to, in order to die, is critical here, they say, because gods don't die, they're eternal. But there's more than just that. The other point is they must live a life under human circumstances, under the testing of what goes on in human society, and have an understanding then of the human condition if he's going to be the judge later on. Although the word high priest suddenly appears here without explanation and is foreign to us for the most part, Dr. Attridge teaches it was not foreign to this audience because this author is suddenly using it with no introduction. It is something they understood. It's us, modern day Christians, that do not have the understanding, because he's not stopping to define it, Attridge says. He's using it in a fashion, clearly, as if his audience has a good understanding, which Attridge then suggests is a strong reflection that these people probably were had a very good background in Judaism, and were likely, as he says, at best, Jewish Christian converts, that is, converted from Judaism to Christianity, or were maybe full-blown. But he feels that term, the sudden introduction of that term, is a powerful argument that the audience is likely to be well informed and fully understands the high priest and who the high priest is at the moment, which would have been prior to 70 AD. So he feels all that helps verify the dating also to place this thing before 70 AD. Hope this is of some help in the understanding of this epistle up to this point, and we'll hope to see you next week.